Good morning and welcome to Dixon's oldest radio program, The Old Timer Show. I'm your host, Justin Spurlock. The Old Timer Show debuted on January the 18th, 1958. And for almost 65 years, it's been the show that proudly celebrates Dixon County's old timers and local history. We've got a great show for you today. Tony England is going to be calling back into the studio with us. Last week, he joined us for part one of the history of Burns. Tony and I have been doing a little bit of research on Burns history, and he's going to come back in and share some of what he knows about the early days of the town, so we're looking forward to that. As many of you know, I'm a history teacher, and I work over at the Dixon County High School, and I write an article for the newspaper every week about local history. This week's article was about Montgomery Bell State Park, and with it being Independence Day weekend, there are a lot of people who are going to be going out to the park and enjoying Montgomery Bell State Park this weekend. And Montgomery Bell State Park has a very interesting story as far as how it got here. And it all goes back to the Great Depression, which began back in 1929. And after a few years, in 1932, the nation was looking for new leadership. And that's when Franklin Delano Roosevelt rose to become the United States president, and he had a plan to end the Great Depression. His plan was called the New Deal. On March the 31st, 1933, FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, signed into legislation a new program. It was called the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and it was the first of the New Deal agencies. The CCC employed young men and gave them an opportunity to develop new skills and prepare them for future employment as the nation recovered from the Great Depression. To put the boys to work, the federal government began looking for sub-marginal land to turn into parks. Several parks were planned for Tennessee. Officials wanted to develop a park in the area around Nashville. Several sites were proposed, including one in Dixon County that laid between the towns of White Bluff and Burns. One of the objectives of the project was to rehabilitate sub-marginal land. So with that in mind, the site in Dixon County was chosen, and construction of the park began in 1935. The land that the park was built on had originally belonged to Colonel Richard Napier, who was given the land through a grant for his service in the Revolutionary War. It was about 1815 that the Laurel Furnace was built on this land to produce pig iron. Ore pits were mined, leaving large craters. Most of the trees were cut down to burn when the furnace was in operation. Therefore, the land was considered submarginal. The land also had other historical significance. Samuel McAdoo established the Cumberland Presbyterian Church on part of the land in 1810, and this was the very first Cumberland Presbyterian Church. After this particular site was selected for the state park, the land had to be acquired by the federal government from local property owners, and the idea was to remove the landowners who were living on this submarginal land and move them to more fertile, better farms. Some of the families that were displaced included the Halls of the Hall Cemetery and Hall Spring area, the Lazers and the Jacksons, who still have a cemetery there in the park, and the Myatt family of Myatt Loop, which is right outside the park. Those were all families that were displaced who used to own land in Montgomery Bell State Park that were moved. Now, the federal government bought that land from those families, and the site was secured for the park. And at that point, the CCC was sent to help with construction. Company 4497, Tennessee SP5, was one of the all African American companies that was sent down here to Dixon County to help construct the park. They were organized back on August the 14th of 1935 at Powell Station near Knoxville. And on December 3rd, 1935, the company was sent to Burns, Tennessee to assist in the construction of the new Montgomery Bell Park. There were other CCC groups who also helped in constructing the park. A young man named Warren Medley, who used to host this show, was part of the construction crew. Warren was born in Putnam County, Tennessee. He was the youngest of 13 children. His father was a farmer who owned a large farm that contained over 100 acres. Warren joined the CCC program because times were tough and he needed a job. They sent him to Dixon County. He worked in the park until the outbreak of World War II, at which point he joined the U.S. Navy. After the war, Warren moved to Dickson County, and he would go on to become an important part of Dickson County's history. The park was officially named after Montgomery Bell, who moved to Tennessee in 1802, the year before Dickson County was formed. Bell helped form the county as he was at the first organizational meeting of county officials. He was also chosen to be part of the committee that established the county seat of Charlotte in 1804. He went on to become one of the largest landholders in the county, and he became Tennessee's first industrialist with his successful iron business. In 1943, Montgomery Bell State Park was finally finished, and it was officially deeded over to the state of Tennessee, and that's why it has an established date, 1943. It officially became known as Montgomery Bell State Park at that point. It was open to the public under the operation of the Tennessee State Parks Department. It opened just in time for the 4th of July celebrations of 1943. Over the years, the park continued to evolve. In 1951, the original inn and restaurant was completed. In the 1970s, a golf course was designed and built within the park. It was named after the former governor of Tennessee, Frank G. Clement, who had been born in Dickson and who had recently died in a 1969 car crash. After the Narrows of the Harpeth, which is located just east of White Bluff, over the border into Cheatham County, became part of the state park system. It fell under the management of Montgomery Bell State Park, which was kind of ironic, I guess, because Montgomery Bell, the man, had owned the land in the 1800s that the Narrows of the Harpeth was located at, and he had built the iron forge there before he died. His grave is actually located near that site, and so little bit of historical significance there. Now, in 1998, a new inn and conference center was built, and a few years ago it was upgraded again. Montgomery Bell State Park is one of the few parks in Tennessee that has a golf course, a restaurant, and a hotel. This makes it very popular destination for travelers. Today, the park attracts visitors from all over the state and the nation, but it will always remain a popular spot for us locals. And that is your history story of the week. We're going to go ahead and take our first break here on the Old Timer Show. When I come back, we're going to talk to Tony England, who's going to give us a little bit more information on Burns history as we listen to part 2 of our conversation on the history of Burns. So we'll be joined by Tony England whenever we get back. Let's go ahead and take our first break right here on WDKN. That many of you are familiar with, but the history of Burns has always been, a little bit of a secret to me. I've always tried to look up some stuff and find out as much information as I can find out about Burns. But we're working on a project over with the Lonesome Cabin to sort of figure out as many details as we can about the early days of Burns. And to do that, I've gone out and looked for as many historians who have information on the topic. And one of those guys is Mr. Tony England. So we're bringing him back in today for part 2 of our History of Burns series. Tony, let's talk at the beginning here just a little bit about how the town of Burns got its name, because that's always been a mystery to me. I know that in 1866, on June 27th of 1866, Burns Station gets its first post office, and that's the first time I've ever read about the town of Burns getting a name, or the early formation of the town started with this railroad stop and a post office. But what do you know about the naming of Burns? I know some people think that it was named after a captain of the Union Army, a soldier of the Union Army that came through here during the Civil War. Some people say it was named after a Captain Robert Burns. Others say it was named after Michael Burns, who was railroad president, who was involved in the construction, or I guess not really the construction, but the sort of overseeing of the railroad in this area way back then. Talk to me just a little bit about what you know about how the town of Burns got its name.
Now, there's been a lot of discussion, and I'll go ahead and start now, about how Burns got its name. So I will go ahead and say, nobody knows how Burns got its name. There's been people saying, it was named after a captain from the Union Army named Robert Burns. All I can say is if I named a town, especially Burns, which my family would have lived in, after a Union soldier who burnt down all the section houses and then even had a prison built there to hold my family, I don't see who in the world would name a town after that man. Now, everybody else is leaning toward Mike Burns, who was the president of the National Northwestern Railroad. I agree. He was very well known. He treated everybody with respect. He even had a train engine named after him, Mike Burns number 10, that went from Nashville to New Johnsonville, back to Nashville, and it was right there on the railroad tracks, Mike Burns. He's always been treated and known. You only heard about the Robert Burns in a write-up that somebody did a few years ago. And the gentleman that wrote that up wasn't even in Burns at the time. He had moved off to Illinois. So there's no telling how Burns honestly got his name. And I got I got documentation where Burns, when they come back in here at the end of the war and burnt down the section houses, there also was 1,000 cords of wood in Burns. McNary and his guerrillas got behind the wood, and when the train come in, they were shooting at them. The conductor pulled the lever and sped off and left the train there with them on the cars shooting. There was a bunch killed, and it said that they come in there and bayoneted the rest. And then they set fire to the 1,000 cords of wood. And they said the fire could be seen as far away as Craigie Hope. So that's pretty good.
So my understanding is that Burns, the town of Burns, formed from this railroad stop that was on the railroad that was built during the Civil War, and that this area was sort of known as Section 36 because it was 36 miles from Nashville, or at least that's what they thought at the time. And talk to me just a little bit about the history of the Civil War and the railroad going through this area.
You are exactly right. When the railroad came through here, Burns was Section 36. There's documentation in the Civil War archives in Washington, D.C., where there was a lot of instances and accidents that happened in Section 36. They would go in there and they would fight a little bit with the Union soldiers, and they would come back down to White Bluff, because White Bluff had a turntable on the railroad, and they would turn the engine around and go back into Nashville. Section 36 was very well documented as far as Civil War goes. There was a lot of stuff that happened there. And yes, they did have a prison in Burns at that time, which was called Section 36. It wasn't Burns yet. And then the documentation I showed you and I put on your website was written in 1872. It says Burns had a prison house that was later converted into a depot.
So during the Civil War, the railroad is constructed through Dickson County, and right at the place that would end up becoming the town of Burns, there was actually a prison camp. Who would have been kept at that prison? I guess it would have been anybody who was not loyal to the Union, or I guess who would they have kept in this prison camp?
Anybody that was against the Union. Anybody. Soldiers, the citizens, anybody that was against the Union would have been in that prison.
That seems to me like a story that has kind of been lost to history, and it's maybe something that a lot of people don't know, and I actually find that very, very interesting.
That's exactly right. And here again, I got documentation proof. A Union colonel came down here between Burns and White Bluff, stood on a bunch of boxes, I guess you could say, and told his army, you go out and you find anybody that's not loyal to the Union, and you bring them in here, and if they fight, you take care of it. So in other words, he said, if they fight, you shoot them. You do away with them. And said, we're going to put an end to this because evidently White Bluff and Burns was two that did not like the Union soldiers. And you're exactly right. It was anybody that was against the Union.
From what I've read, the main reason that the Union Army was here in Dickson County was to protect that railroad from guerrilla attacks.
You're exactly right. Harper's Ferry had 7 or 8 bridges, trestles, going across the rivers, and they had to protect each one. Not just McNary, but Hood and a few more would burn them down just every chance they got. They would rebuild it, and then they would tear it and burn it down again.
There's a lot of history when it comes to the railroad that comes through Dickson County. And one thing that I want to mention while we're talking about it is that there were a lot of all African American regiments that came in here not only to help build the railroad, but also to stay and protect it. These all black groups, some of the first black soldiers that were in the Union or United States Army were here in Dickson County, and I find that to be very historic.
I agree, and there was. You had the 101st Confederate, not Confederate Union. You had the 13th Michigan, and they was all blacks. Several, and General, I can't pronounce his name now, but anyway, he mainly sent a bunch of them to protect the trestles, and that's exactly what they did. That's exactly what they did.
Well, Tony, thanks for calling in again and telling us a little bit about the history of Burns. We truly appreciate it, and we're going to keep this series going. I've got a lot more questions that I want to ask you, and we want to find out some more about the history of Burns. Let's go ahead and take another commercial break, and we'll be right back here on WDKN. And we're back here on the Old Timers Show, right here on WDKN, and it is the 4th of July, Independence Day weekend. And we hope that you're all safe and you all enjoy festivities all around the county. There are plenty of things going on to celebrate the 4th of July. And one of the things that we celebrate when we get together is the birth of our nation, and we look back on all of the people who have really made America the great place that it is. And when you think back to people who have meant a lot to this county specifically, who have done a lot for this nation, there's one guy who comes to mind. He's a rather young fella, but his story is one that's really important and that I hope that we never forget, and that's John Carlos Baker. He has a very interesting story, and I want you to be watching next week on Wednesday when my newspaper article comes out. It'll talk about John Carlos and the unique sacrifice that he gave to this nation. And so I want to take just a few minutes this morning to tell you a little bit about John Carlos Baker. And so in order to tell this story, we have to go all the way back to 1941, because it was on December 7th, 1941, that the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. FDR said that it was a date that would live in infamy. That attack on Hawaii was the single event that shocked the nation and sent the United States into World War II. Young men from all across the nation, including Dickson County, began signing up for service. They wanted to fight back, but there were some boys who wanted to do something, wanted to help, wanted to be part of the cause, but maybe they weren't quite old enough to fight, but still wanted to help make a difference. One of these young men was named John Carlos Baker. John paid the ultimate sacrifice in 1942. He was just a young elementary school student when he died, serving his country at home right here in Dickson County. John Carlos Baker was born on December 27, 1931, on his grandparents' farm just off of Furnace Hollow Road, right outside of the city of Dickson. His parents lived on Highway 70, just west of Dickson, near West Dell Road. John was born just as the Great Depression was getting started, and times were tough in this area, as well as pretty much everywhere, and it was like that during pretty much his whole childhood. When John was old enough, he began attending school at Oakmont. He attended the first Oakmont school that, as many of you know, was located on Walnut Street. It's no longer there now, but you can still see the steps to the old school there if you look close enough. Now, John, he loved sports. His classmates described him as a tough dude who was well liked and who loved playing football and doing other things outdoors. His teacher at Oakmont said that John was a happy child who was cooperative in the classroom and had an endearing personality. World War II occurred at an unusual time in American history. As the Great Depression was coming to an end, almost everything, including food and raw materials, were in short supply. We were not prepared for a war, but Americans were willing to do what was necessary to fight back. During the Depression, people didn't have enough money to replace the things that broke. So people didn't throw things away. They would save things for parts. So I guess they literally saved everything. Nobody threw anything away, from what I've been told. So there was a lot of scrap just laying around, and that included scrap metal. All across the country, school children were enlisted to go out and find scrap metal. We needed the scrap metal to build things like guns, weapons, ammunition, tanks, airplanes. Everything needed scrap metal. So they needed to find as much of this scrap as they could find so they could get the metal to help the military build these things. Local school systems held scrap metal collection drives to gather metal that could be used for the military. Now, on Wednesday, October the 7th, 1942, is when the tragedy occurred. That was the day that Oakmont was holding a scrap metal drive, and John Carlos Baker and his fellow classmates went out looking for scrap that day. John went to get a long metal pipe near his home on Highway 70 that had been donated by one of his neighbors. While John was transporting this pipe back to his house, it came in contact with a high voltage electric wire, and John was actually accidentally killed. The entire town of Dixon and people all across the county were shocked and saddened to learn of John's death. He was only 10 years old. The news traveled all across the country. The United States Army honored John's mother as a Gold Star Mother. That's a recognition given to a mom whose child dies defending the country. John became a hero and an example to young children all across the nation. Everyone could do their part. Newspapers published stories about John. He inspired millions of children to get involved in the war and to do what they could at home. John's funeral was held at Walnut Street Church of Christ. They decided to cancel school so that all of his classmates and teachers could attend his funeral service. He was buried in the Union Cemetery in downtown Dixon. And today, you can see his memorial that's right there in downtown Dixon. A few months later, after he was buried, there was a memorial service that was held at the cemetery in his honor, and it was attended by more than 500 children. A beautiful monument was unveiled by John's sister, and that beautiful monument is there, and I was able to see it recently. There were 3 speakers who paid tribute to John that day when they unveiled this monument. And that was the mayor of Dixon, the Dixon County judge, and the publisher of the Dixon Banner newspaper. There was a tribute that was written by Tennessee Governor Prentice Cooper that was also read at this ceremony. An annual program put on by Dixon County Schools was also established to remember John, and a memorial fund was set up to purchase children's books for the library. Many books were purchased because of this fund. According to John's 5th grade teacher, on his last Friday at school, he helped paint bookshelves for his classroom. It was in that spirit that the American Legion Auxiliary wanted to establish a memorial for John Carlos Baker at the Dickson County Public Library. The children's section in the Dickson County Public Library is an ongoing memorial to John Carlos Baker. At the previous library, there was a plaque with a photo and a story about him written by Rick Hollis for the Dickson County Bicentennial. And the children's section was officially named the John Carlos Baker Children's Library in his honor at that time. Now, a few years ago, when the Dickson County Library moved across the street and opened a bigger, nicer facility, that children's library was expanded, and of course it will always be connected to John Carlos Baker and his sacrifice. So as we go into the 4th of July on Monday, and you're thinking back to the people who helped found this nation, and you think back to people who have made America a great place, John Carlos Baker is somebody that you can look back on and smile and know that, he did everything that he could, not only to make Dickson County a better place, but also his nation, and he paid the ultimate sacrifice. That's going to do it here for the Old Timer Show. We appreciate everybody listening. I appreciate my guest, Tony England, coming back in today and talking a little bit more about the history of Burns. We will continue that series. We've got a few more questions for Tony, and we'd like to know a little more information about the history of Burns and all of the great information about that town that he has shared with us so far has been fascinating. And so I hope you'll tune in again next week as we learn a little bit more about local history. Again, thank you for listening. Stay tuned. Dale Reagan's show is next, and I'll be back with you at 8 o'clock for a new episode of Know Your County. You're listening to WDKN.